Hi, welcome back to another episode of What's Going On.
A Social Studies Network podcast. I'm Maeve.
And I'm Mary, where we discuss different topics in the social studies field.
Today we're talking about bringing multiple perspectives into the social studies curriculum.
Right.
Let's get into it.
So, Maeve, could you tell me about your social studies education? Do you feel like it was diverse enough?
The first answer that comes to my mind is no, at least for the very beginning of my educational experience with social studies. There were times when I felt it was very repetitive in that we were learning the exact same things year after year from the exact same viewpoints. And it wasn't up until the later end of my education and then when I got into college that I started being able to explore different perspectives in social studies, whether that be through just the same event from different people's perspectives or through different mediums of research. And I don't know if that's exactly a reflection of my education personally either or the entire education as a whole. But yeah, that's really how I feel about it just off the top of my head. What do you think? How do you feel about your own educational experience?
So, my education in high school in social studies was primarily history, right? It was world history and U.S. history. And even though world history, for example, did take into account like global and international like events and histories, it was very limited. And I feel like that's also something that happened in U.S. history, right? Like we had a unit on Native Americans, but it was very surface level and glossed over. And like you said, I don't know if it was just because of the curriculum my school had, or is it like a whole national thing, right? I feel like there were some classes that did dig deeper into like some more diverse cultures, we'll say, like Latin American history and African American history, right? But those were very separate from like the main curriculum, so I never really got that experience of interacting with those cultures.
I feel the same way. I'm recalling now that I did take a U.S. history course, but I don't know. Did you take your AP
Yes.
U.S. history? It was just a standard. I'm sorry. Was it a world history?
Yes.
I recall I took a world history course. Did you take was AP world history a thing? Okay. Well, it was just a general world history course, and it didn't focus on U.S. history as much as I remember, which I'm very grateful for that I had that opportunity. It is kind of what you were saying about individual units. While that U.S. history course did not focus very much on U.S. history, it did look at certain other cultures through a U.S. lens. So, in the way of kind of like subdividing it into units. When we're trying to talk about this and incorporate it in our curriculum, there's that fear of being wrong and saying the wrong thing. But in order to, we need to have those conversations. So it feels weird, like saying we're putting these people into units, because it is kind of weird. Like we can't define an entire culture by a 4-week unit. And so that's kind of what we're getting at here is how do we move past that in a way to incorporate other cultures in the social studies curriculum, other cultures and identities, without blocking it off into units.
Right, like how do we truly integrate these topics, not just like slap it on, right? Like you said, just give it 4 weeks and then we move on. Because when you don't integrate and like center these things, you kind of just tend to like brush past it or just not really explore it, right? I could tell you very little about my Native American unit, even though I feel like it should have taken like a much stronger presence in my curriculum, right?
And that's something I was thinking about. And this isn't only a social studies problem. I think about this most with my math, is I study so hard for like a test at the end of a unit. And once that test is gone, it's all out the door. And so that might be a critique on the system as a whole. How do we move away from making students feel that what they're learning isn't important, it's only important for a test. But when it comes to like social studies education, we're kind of looking at how do we raise up these cultures and put a spotlight on them in a respectful way that makes students sorry, how do we like raise up these cultures and put a spotlight on them in a respectful way to make students appreciate them?
Yeah, I feel like part of that is like really making sure the students connect with it, right? I think the way that history is kind of structured, like the way we teach it, does give us like a certain distance to the events that happened, right? We tend to think of it as a 2D timeline and not like a web of events that affects us today, right? Like,
Well, I like how you use the web analogy and how it affects us today, because like if you like it's a very interesting analogy, but like if you pull one edge of a web, the entire thing bounces. And like you said, it's not just a one strand. There's multiple different perspectives, and like on this web, when you pull one perspective and the whole thing bounces, it really shows how interconnected all of our cultures and identities are with social studies. And it makes you wonder, so why aren't we incorporating them as thoroughly into our curriculum as the standard history?
right, like we see this web in history and we also see it today, right? We affect each other, and when we ignore like a certain group, either racially or ethnically, right, we kind of neglect part of what our society looks like.
Going back to what you said about feeling that disconnect, I definitely agree. Looking back, and maybe like reading a history textbook, you look back and you really don't feel any connection to those of the past, either because it was so long ago or you just don't see yourself in the curriculum, ethnically, racially, identity-wise. So it can really be hard. So it can be really difficult for students to connect with a history curriculum when they feel that disconnect. And it's hard for me to think of an example of this because I find history very interesting, and it's easy for me to get intertwined with the past and think and just be interested in it altogether. But I feel like I'm looking through a window at history. I'm only reading about it, and I don't feel a great connection to the events themselves, as in how I really feel that disconnect with how certain events have an impact on me. And like you said, and like when we pull something from the web, I can see how it affects everything. I just have a difficult time relating to what's going around me.
I feel like I had an experience like that, right, where I felt like a disconnect, even though I was very interested in what was being taught. I felt like it was just about other people, or like you said, like a window into the past, but no real like interaction with it, right? For example, like World War One, that I thought that was very interesting, and it was part of global history, but it was the way it's taught right now. It's like very focused on what the U.S. and European nations did, right? And the only like real deviations we see from it are like very little. I feel like what stood out to me the most as a Mexican was kind of like a small mention of Mexico and Germany and the Zimmerman telegram, right? Even though that's like a kind of very small part of like the whole history, it stood out to me a lot because I kind of saw myself, right? I was very proud of my people, right? So I feel like that kind of feeling is very important because even though you might be very interested in what's going on, the things that connect to you and that you can relate with, I think you bring that with you further than just the classroom.
And I like how you mentioned World War One, and this goes the same for World War Two. Is it World War?
Yeah.
And you can see that these other, just even like other than like these Southern Hemisphere countries played a big role in these world wars. And I feel like even now, their presence in the world wars aren't as heavily discussed. And I feel like, and I was just very surprised about finding out about the roles of smaller African countries and South American countries in World War One and Two. So,
right. So there's like this kind of like Western Eurocentrist, right, view that we carry with us a lot in our history.
And like you said, we have this kind of like Western, like Eurocentric, Westernized view of history, and I think that might stem from like early education forms of history, because we're in America. It's great to start out with American history as a great launching pad, but it's also difficult because America is such a young country that if starting at the Declaration of Independence is very late in the game in history wise. So as schools become more and more diverse, incorporating multiple cultures in social studies curriculums, even as young as elementary school, could be very beneficial for the students and really lay the stepping stones for a great education, especially in social studies.
Mm-hmm. I think it's important for students, especially younger ones, to have this opportunity because it helps them build an awareness of not just like the society they live in and like the world as a whole, but also kind of like their identities and their place in the world, right? They can have a better understanding of like their social and cultural identities and the social and cultural identities of their peers, right?
At the very baseline, it helps them learn empathy for each other and to grow better relationships. I also liked what you said about how students can learn more about themselves. I think this is a great way for students to learn more about their cultures and identities is through a diverse education. And I feel like in a way that's something you learn through family and at home, but it's great to be able to share that with peers, your discoveries and your curiosity of who you are.
Right, and like these things are important even like in higher education, right? This curiosity doesn't go away the more students grow, right?
Yeah, I like how you said that it continues into higher education, into middle and high school. And I feel like how you incorporate a diverse education doesn't really change based on what level of education you're in. I feel like all of what we're about to talk about can be applied to elementary, and it could be applied to high school.
Right, it's just like a matter of complexity in the way, or the content you cover, right?
The level of content. A child, an elementary school student may not be able to read a full-fledged research paper, but they may understand a picture book that touches on the same topics. So, and that's one way to incorporate diverse perspectives, is to bring in outside resources, such as stories with a different narrative of a certain event in history. So, like, what I mean by that is, if we were talking about the Revolutionary War, how can we also incorporate an African American's perspective of the Revolutionary War and an indigenous person's perspective on the Revolutionary War, as we also talk about the early Americans' perception.
Right, and if you wanted to bring in like more modern examples, you could talk about different events that happen in the different perspectives marginalized or non-dominant groups had, such as like women or college students, especially in events like the Vietnam War, right?
Yeah, I feel like what you say about college students, because that's we do focus on like the protests of college students with things like the Vietnam War. Those aren't really the main focus when talking about the Vietnam War. It's again one of those things that's kind of sprinkled on top. And that reminded me of a documentary I watched in a course last year. It was a documentary about the wives of American soldiers and the wives of the Vietnamese soldiers, and how the war really affected them. And just from a baseline that it was from a woman's perspective, we really don't get that in things such as war stories, and especially the Vietnam War. And then going on a deeper level, it really brought to my eyes the different struggles of these two countries, and how the American women were at home worrying about their husbands. The Vietnamese women were in Vietnam while the war was going on. They were surrounded by war. So they had to worry about their husbands and the war that was going on around them. And that just really going from that two-dimensional line into a very three-dimensional version of history.
Right, because like the Vietnam War is basically chalked up to being like a struggle between like capitalism and communism, right? And like global powers just struggling on controlling those two, right? But when we stay with narratives like those, we miss, I guess the more human narratives, right? How do you feel like your perspective of the Vietnam War changed because of that documentary?
My perspective really changed as it became more than a war. This was people's lives. It made me feel more connected to history because I was able to reflect and relate to those who were present in the documentary and really engage with their stories. And so it made me curious about how could I incorporate this into my own classroom. And as we were saying, really bringing in multiple perspectives of a singular event in history. And I like what you were saying about more modern examples of history, because we are living in history. This moment is history. It will be history very soon. And I think something we did discuss was, while bringing in like outside narratives are great, they are sometimes confined to a two-dimensional source, and how we can change that is bringing in members of the community. And I was wondering what you think about bringing in such as parents and community members into the classroom to become a part of a history lesson.
I think it's a very good idea, right? It engages with the students a lot, and it gives them the opportunity to connect with people in their community about their lived experiences, right? Even though like younger people may not have the experience of living through like big world events, perhaps their teachers, their parents, their uncles, or maybe like, I don't know, the crossing guard down the street, right? Like they lived through it and they have their own narratives to tell, right?
It can be hard to relate to things in history when we don't see how they affect us. And that's why it's also important to start building in a diverse education early on so students can build their empathy and respect for one another, but also being able to see the person in front of you and recognize that they lived through something is also very beneficial. And I feel like my question was a bit mean in saying that bringing in people as part of history, I'm not calling anyone old, but like the people around us are great resources.
So one of the things that reminded me of was this assignment I had when I was in middle school or high school, where one of our history teachers asked us to go out and interview our parents about a certain event, right? My community is primarily Hispanic, Latin, and most of the families there either are first generation, second generation, third generation, right? So there's that knowledge of what it's like to immigrate and start a new life, right? And through that, it kind of like activity, I got to learn more about immigration and how that process is like. Even if that information was always like told by my mom, I kind of got like that new perspective, and I got to apply it to the way I see the world, right? You know, I was wondering, do you think there are other ways to kind of incorporate like the community in the classroom?
I definitely did like what you say about talking to specifically family members, because at least I feel like in the family interactions I've witnessed, sometimes it's difficult for family members to talk about their experiences. And sometimes, well, they do want to talk about it, you just have to go and ask. Because if you don't express curiosity, they may feel like you don't really care. So it's always great to talk to your family and close friends about their experiences. And another way to incorporate the community is kind of like the opposite of like going to them, is bringing the community to you, bring them into the classroom. Give them that platform to speak to students, or at least a wider range of students. This would help students gain perspectives from outside their family on events that their families may not have experienced. So kind of, again, like rounding it out. It's also important to recognize that the teacher is a great resource as someone who's also experienced a great deal of things and is able to give their insight onto certain topics.
You know, I feel like that's very interesting too, because sometimes the teacher has like the same background as the students, and the students can kind of see themselves in their teacher, right? They see that they understand what they're going through, and they kind of see like mentor, a guiding figure, right? That they can look to for answers when they don't know how to interact with the world, right? Or, you know, even if the teacher doesn't have the same background as they do, they also gain that like valuable experience of seeing like the similarities and differences between them, and again, like new perspectives.
Yeah, that's a great topic as in itself. When you see your like having a teacher you can relate to. I don't want to dive too deep into that because I could talk about that for hours. But it's also, yeah, like you said, it's just a teacher is another great resource in the classroom that can help students expand their perspectives.
You know, for teachers, students could also be a very good resource, right? They have their own lived experiences and their own perspectives that, you know, teachers could pick up on and try to reflect in their curriculums when they try to adapt it to them. You know, and then there's also this pressure of getting, you know, this diverse or maybe like progressive curriculum right the first time, but there really shouldn't be, right?
Yeah, and I feel like that pressure to get it right sometimes stops us from diversifying our curriculum because obviously we don't want to hurt anyone's culture or identity in the process of educating maybe the entire classroom. This reminds me of how at my internship this summer we discussed the importance of knowing when you're wrong and how to apologize to your students. That is an important aspect of teaching, and I feel like we don't see it, well, at least I didn't see it very much growing up in my educational career. It's something I didn't see growing up much in my educational career, and it's something I want to incorporate because teachers are humans too, and they won't get things right on the first try. And that's the great thing about education. We are always learning, teachers and students, always learning, always growing. So it's okay to make mistakes. And things do change, especially, well, maybe not so much with history, but as we learn more about the past, things do change, and it's important to always update the curriculum and what we are teaching our students.
Right, like the lens that we adopt or the way that we kind of like break down and understand history, that tends to change a lot. And, you know, kind of like being able to say, you know, I was wrong or I didn't get this quite right the first time. I think that's very important when you're teaching. It humanizes you to your students, and your students can see like you don't have to get it right the first time, but it is important to have that kind of strength and that vulnerability as well to say, you know, I was wrong, and have that curiosity and willingness to try again and to learn more about it so you can do it better next time.
When teachers admit their mistakes, it fosters that environment where failure is okay and allows students to understand that they may not get something right the first time, they may not get something right the second time, but it's okay, and it's okay to fail from time to time because teachers are also in the same boat as them.
And then as a teacher, when you're trying to build this curriculum, that communication is very important, right? If you're taking this journey alongside your students, you're able to see what's relevant to them, what they're interested in, and the way that they're connecting with the material that you're presenting to them. And having that communication with your students where you're able to, you know, take that journey of learning with them is very important as you try to develop and maybe update your curriculum as, you know, world events happen, as new perspectives emerge, or as your students' needs may change, right?
And that will prepare students for their lives outside of the classroom.
Yeah, it's well worth the effort, yeah. You know, as we're finishing up this talk, we hope that you take away some things from our conversation, right? Namely, just kind of new perspectives on the kind of benefits you'd get from offering different perspectives to your students and connecting with their identities and their own experiences as you build your curriculum. We hope that we've given you some ideas on how to incorporate different perspectives and people's experiences in your classroom, and that you take with you a curiosity to learn with your students.
And as always, take care.
And stay aware.